Your land is your domain.
They loved their house on the hill. It was kind of like their own little kingdom.
You protect it the way you protect your life.
I would call it a feud. Everything that the other did angered his neighbor.
It can happen anywhere, to anybody.
You fight for it. And sometimes you kill for it. People search their whole lives to find a place like this.
It's rural, very, very attractive area, nice homes of professional people.
Carmel Valley is very close-knit. People know each other there because it is so small.
Our town is special, but if you're really lucky, you get to live up in the hills.
It was pretty spectacular, the views from Carmel Valley. It was very, very beautiful.
Mel Grimes moved up here in 1988. He's an avid surfer, a marathon runner.
Mel was just a really nice guy, always happy, never had anything negative to say about anybody.
Just a really fun guy to hang out with. But at the same time, just really mellow. He just kind of did his own thing, and I really dug him.
The good time fitness buff is also a tough first-class defense lawyer.
He was very highly regarded in our community. He was very able. He was a strong litigator, a worthy adversary.
Give him a break. He deserves a break.
Years ago, Mel found his soulmate in his wife, Elizabeth.
Honey! Oh.
My mom was a nurse. She was working at the office next door to his. He asked her out on a date one day. My mom said yes, and then from that point on, it was just they really were into each other.
Honey?
They were inseparable. I would almost say that out of any couple that I know, I think they were perfectly right with each other.
They'd both been divorced. This time was going to be different. Elizabeth moved into Mel's house on the hill, and they got married in 1995. The Grimes were all set to live happily ever after. But conflict can change people. For the worse. In 1999, someone new moves into the place next door. They don't come more impressive than John Kenny, Korean War veteran, a doctorate from MIT. He travels the world as a high-level consultant with the oil industry. Friends call him Jack.
That goes right there.
Jack was extremely clever and very well read, and he was blessed with an almost perfect memory. So if you wanted to take him on in an argument, you better have all your facts. He wasn't really interested in a half-baked opinion. In company, he was very polite and friendly, especially towards women. He had this old-world patrician manner to him. He would stand up when a woman came into the room, for example.
John's wife is a doctor in France. Their respective careers keep him apart from her and their two adoptive daughters for months at a time.
He lived alone in the house.
At first glance, our neighbors didn't have much in common.
Hi, I'm Mel Grimes.
Still, they hit it off.
My wife, Elizabeth.
They were definitely friends. They would hang out and talk on the driveway. They were very neighborly.
There were times when he'd given Mrs. Grimes the key to his house because he was away for long periods.
We were happy to see the two neighbors getting along so well, and John was a welcome addition to the community.
He went to Bible study with this group in Carmel Valley.
I went with him on a couple of occasions just out of interest. And there were 5 or 6 people around a table discussing the Bible. I could see how well respected Jack was in this group. He was very polite, and they were all polite to him, and they obviously held him in high regard.
As John settles in, the friendship grows.
Good dog. You enjoying that, eh? Good.
The Grimes dog would go over to the Kenny property.
He would feed him and hang out with him.
John, how are you?
Oh, fine. How are you?
For a while, there is peace in the valley, but sharp differences begin to surface.
Everything was neat and tidy around his house. He was an elderly gentleman. He didn't have a lot of stuff, so his yard wasn't cluttered.
Oh, what do you think?
My parents' house was definitely a little bit more, gosh, how could you say, decorated their own way. My parents collected the weirdest stuff. But the thing was no one could see it except for him. And then you look down at his house and it was just, everything was perfect.
As the months go by, John's need for order begins to assert itself.
Good afternoon, Elizabeth.
Hi, John, how are you?
Good. Say, where'd you get those plants? They're not aggressive, are they? I mean, I don't want them growing over in my property.
Slowly but surely, living side by side starts feeling way too close for comfort.
How's that? Well, you get your dog digging a hole in my lawn here, nothing more than that. That's not so bad. Yeah, well, I gotta fix it.
They were such different people.
Here, take your dog home.
The dog may be annoying, but the Grimes and John Kenny still need to get along. After all, they share the same private driveway.
These kind of common driveways shared by multiple homes is very, very, very typical throughout Monterey County.
The shared road leads to 2 carports, one for the Grimes, one for Kenny. Space is tight. They have to drive over each other's property to get into their carports. No big deal, at least in the beginning. The real problem is the small wooden bridge that crosses a creek at the bottom of their hill. The Grimes and Kenny drive over that bridge every day to reach their homes, and it needs work.
It was old, it was falling apart. They wanted to tackle it before it just collapsed and then no one could get across.
Jack said to the Grimes, we need to get this bridge repaired. And Grimes said, I'll do it. And Jack said, what do you mean you'll do it? Mr. Grimes said, well, I'll repair it. It'll be much cheaper. We won't have to pay a contractor.
I mean, this is dangerous. You gotta...
Mel had a lot of clients that owed him, you know, money and couldn't pay, but they could pay in labor.
Oh, here you are.
Yeah, I got the whalers for you.
That's how Mel took care of it. He just, you know, all right, build a deck or do some yard work or, you know, do some landscaping or help me move this or that.
But John Kenny doesn't want to cut corners on this bridge. It has to be built to code. Otherwise, vehicles could crash through it and end up in the creek.
So Jack went back to Grimes and said, we have to do this officially. And Grimes gave him the cold shoulder treatment.
John goes along, but apparently he gets tired of waiting for Mel to get the job done.
Kenny took it upon himself to have an engineer come out,
Good. Yeah. So, I mean, the whole thing, gone.
draw up the plans, get it going. I mean, he did all this on his own, had the work done, then basically handed a bill to my parents.
There you go. Well, mister.
And my parents just, they didn't agree to that.
And I could have got it done for half the price. I ain't gonna pay a penny.
Life on the hill is starting to get nasty, and it's not going to stop.
It got ugly.
Their little piece of paradise was being torn asunder.
I think that they each felt a mutual provocation. It just seemed to kind of snowball.
Mel and Elizabeth Grimes are arguing with their neighbor John Kenny about a big bill. John rebuilt a bridge they both use, and he wants the Grimes to pay their share.
Pay half of it. We go to court.
Kenny sued my parents for the portion that Kenny believed that they should have to pay for.
There was no doubt in Jack's mind that he was entitled to recover this money from Grimes.
The court rules in John's favor. Now, things are going to escalate.
I'll never forget my mom calling me in Santa Barbara going, Mel's pissed. Mel is, he's really fired up about this. And that's when things really started getting bad.
At the same time, someone else on the hill runs into problems with the Grimes. Neighbor Stephen Young says they've been using his land as an illegal dump site.
There were refrigerators in there with leaking refrigerant. There were oil cans leaking oil. And there's also a requirement in California that you can't take invasive weeds off one property and dump them on another. The Grimes, they don't care about the impact on other people. They chose to dump the stuff and all this waste on our land.
Things don't go well when Youngs asks the Grimes to get rid of the junk.
The atmosphere turned very frosty very quickly, and Mr. Grimes adopted a very strange attitude.
Just like with the bridge, nothing happens. Youngs lays a formal complaint with environmental authorities, and the Grimes eventually comply with a cleanup order. Mostly.
In fact, he didn't get rid of it all. He left a lot of it on our land. He took away all the waste that was on his land, but managed to leave strategic bits on my land to punish me, you see. This was his idea. He didn't have to comply fully with the law. He could just do enough.
Doing just enough is no longer acceptable to the Grimes' closest neighbor. John Kenny finally gets fed up with their dog running wild through his manicured world.
Mr. Kinney complained that it would come over and mess on his property. I think that he even claimed that Mel and Elizabeth gathered dog refuse and threw it on his property.
They were forcing their dogs onto his land and onto my land to defecate. Completely unnecessary.
The dog used to go down to the house when everything was good with John, and he would feed him. So any dog, you feed a dog, it's gonna come back.
Get off my property! Get your hands off my dog. You don't on my lawn
He
here.
called animal control. Animal control would come up and be like, hey, your dog needs to be on a leash. They can't go over here. You know, they gotta keep him on your property.
Dog. All right, get back in there.
That really drove my mom nuts.
Our neighbor looks at the Grimes and sees chaos. But maybe the issue is his obsession with order.
I'd almost say insane, just how organized it was. I'll never forget, like, just looking at even, like, his wood pile. It was just like, whoa, this guy is, like, you know, he's got stages of wood piled up here, you know, by size.
Order and chaos clash again. This time, over the shared driveway.
Because of how the driveway was set up, you would have to back down my parents' driveway and then back up his to go back down the rest of the driveway. And, you know, I had been doing that before he had moved in and was never an issue.
Kenny decided, as this dispute escalated, this feud, to really draw a line in the dirt. He wanted to assert what he believed to be his property rights.
Worked out really well.
Hey, don't want you guys driving this property line here, okay?
Why?
What are you talking about?
Oh, come on.
And he's like, that's my piece of dirt. You can't back your van out over that.
You haven't done your research. This is my property, and I don't want you driving on it.
You have to understand, this piece of property was like the size of a surfboard. It was very tiny.
Why don't you talk to me like that again?
Surveyors are brought in to mark out property lines. But that doesn't bring any peace to the hill.
And then it started to get worse. I would get phone calls from my mom, you know, upset, just not herself, voice sounds different, stressful.
The Grimes respond in their own way.
They had no trespassers signs made up, and they stuck them on every post on the fence line that was between Jack's land and their land. Now, it only faced Jack's property. This is directly in Jack's face, no trespassing. It's just a bizarre thing to do. This has to be a very aggressive person.
Mr. Kenny felt that they were provoking him.
Even a little bit.
He has no rhythm at all.
They would blare music. They would set speakers up in their front garden and blare music out, heavy rock music. Now, they're entitled to play music, but on and on and on, you begin to wonder, well, is this an aggravation or not?
I was right there.
The escalating conflict gets increasingly personal.
My mom had a meditation room built, and that thing was built without permits. The carport was built without permits. And once John Kenny started figuring out these structures were built illegally, then he started to turn my parents in to the county on those things.
My name is Dr. John Franklin Kenny. I'm the nearest neighbor to Mr. Grimes. When a neighbor puts up some structure which damages your property or damages your enjoyment of it, when you come before the planning commission, excuse me, this is illegal, it's unpermitted, deny it.
If Elizabeth can't enjoy her private retreat, the Grimes make sure John won't enjoy his either.
They reported him for a kind of a gazebo or a glass appurtenance to the back of his house that he used, and apparently he built that without a permit.
Mrs. Grimes, I thought we had an understanding. Get those plants off my property.
I don't think their home felt like home anymore. I think they were too fearful of Mr. Kenny.
I think they had an objective to get rid of him. I think they wanted him out of that house and to give up and move away.
And in this war, anything goes.
He was out of control. He was red in the face, and he was extremely angry. California's a weird place, and there are weird people everywhere. And you never know what your neighbor is underneath the surface.
This should have been paradise by the sea. But for some of our neighbors, Carmel Valley is turning into a living hell.
was going to be paid for, and now you...
Mel Grimes would never back down to a bully. He was quite a guy, strong-willed, in my view, fearless.
No.
The Grimes were bullies to anyone that opposed them.
No, you have...
And, you know, some people you can bully and they'll back down and they'll be intimidated, but Jack wasn't that sort of a person. If you bullied him, it would make him more determined to stand up.
I remember telling my mom and Mel just one day, I'm like, you know, why don't you guys move? But it was like, no, we were here first. They had no intentions of ever moving. And they were really adamant about staying.
What makes everything so complicated is the shared driveway. Mel Grimes decides to cement over a small part of it he claims is communal. John Kenny contends it isn't.
In his scientific view of the law said that that little spit of land was his land and nobody else was supposed to touch it. And he expected and demanded that he was right.
Like the battle over the bridge, this one doesn't go Mel's way either. The cement pad can't stay.
I see Mr. Grimes thumping this piece of concrete with his sledgehammer. And he was out of control. He was red in the face, and he was extremely angry.
Each dispute escalated into the next one. And each time that escalation happened, the feelings got harder and harder.
But there is no backing down for either of our neighbors. After winning the cement pad battle, Kenny returns to the bigger campaign over property lines on the shared driveway.
He planted a garden on this dirt patch. And the dirt patch is, you know, it's about 10 feet long and, you know, a few feet wide. Planted this garden to stake out his right to this patch.
This garden stops the Grimes from getting into their carport, or so John thinks.
Mel knew the law. He knew that you couldn't place something there to block Kenny from getting out of his driveway, and vice versa.
Mel came home one day and saw the little garden there, and it blocked his access to his carport, and he just drove his car right over it and actually backed up and forth.
Totally destroying it. Proof again to Kenny that the Grimes could do whatever they wanted.
And Mr. Kenny came down the driveway in his car.
Hey, what are you doing?
And was taking photographs of Mel.
We're allowed to drive on there.
My mom lunged at him to pull the camera away from him.
There was a camera strap that was around Kenny's neck. And it pulled Kenny's head into the door jamb of the vehicle.
Elizabeth yanked the camera away from him with enough force that it actually broke the camera strap, according to Mr. Kenny.
When I took Kenny to the hospital, he looked like a 90-year-old man. He really did. He looked a wreck. He was frightened of everyone. It was disgraceful that someone should do this to this old man. To abuse him in this way, to bully him, and then to attack him in this way, and to break the lanyard of a camera. I mean, this is nylon. Must have been huge force. And You know, Jack said they tried to kill me. That's right, those were his words, they've tried to kill me.
My mom, like, on her best day in heels was maybe 5 feet tall, and this guy was well over 6 feet. I mean, it just seemed weird. It didn't seem like it added up. Just like, you did that, Mom? Like, there's no way. And she's like, yeah, he's full of it.
Yeah, take it in. That's all. I don't care.
It really just changed her whole perspective on the outlook of life and other people. It upset her. You know, she would cry. She just didn't feel, she felt imprisoned at her own home.
Some of us felt bad for John Kenny. Some of us felt just as bad for what the Grimes were going through. And none of us could imagine what was to come.
My mom went from my whole life telling me that, you know, people are good, trust people, to people are evil, people are bad, watch out for them. I had no idea that it would ever escalate to something like this.
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
You don't mess with...
He knew that he was building this up in their lives, up to a breaking point where they were gonna snap.
Stop! Stop!
In our quiet little town of Carmel Valley, California, a fight over property lines is rapidly spiraling out of control.
I just saw him shaking like this. I said, well, the police are gonna come.
Both sides report the confrontation to the sheriff, but no charges are laid. A classic case of he said, she said.
Kenny wanted a filing on the Grimes for battery, but I know it did not get filed by our office.
Elizabeth knows where John goes to church, so she writes to his pastor.
Dear Pastor Hong, I am the lady who called you a couple of weeks ago. I asked you if you might be able to offer us some counseling or mediation.
John fires back.
I am out of patience with your cowardly, gutter-mouth behavior.
I assume that this is not something Mr. Kenny
Behavior
wants
is
to do.
unacceptable by any standards of civilized
That you
conduct.
continue to keep us in your prayers.
Nothing comes of the exchange, so Elizabeth takes the battle public.
My mom probably just got an idea in her head, like, hey, I'm gonna, you know, church is a place where everybody gets together to get beyond things and work things out.
Prepare to know that it's going to happen to us every
John,
time.
we need to talk.
The whole community knows what's going on. Look at us. Look at my finger. Look at your neck. Listen to me.
She did go there and interrupted a Bible study meeting. She asked for prayer for resolution, and according to Kenny, questioned his Christianity. How could he be at a Bible study class professing to be Christian when he was harassing her and her husband over such trivial things?
What kind of Christian are you that all you care about is your reputation?
That's such an affront to a man in front of his friends and in a church. I mean, it was such an abuse of Jack, and I think that tore away the last shred of Jack's privacy. He thought to himself, you know, I'm not safe anywhere.
And it looks like the Grimes feel the same way.
Mel was very mellow about it, but I knew that it bothered him inside. He knew how to handle the stress that well. He had always taken care of everyone else's problems, but for himself, he didn't really know how to, like, maintain his own stress. Finally, it had broke Mel. He developed an irregular heartbeat. Doctor was just like, your #1 killer right now is stress, and that's what's gonna give you a heart attack.
That's really, really bad.
You have to help us. You
have to do something. We can't.
About 2 weeks after the scene at church, we heard both sides asked for restraining orders.
Something's wrong with him.
I thought they were going to come over here, but they didn't.
When you file that kind of request in California, there is a box on the form and a requirement that states whether you have guns. Mr. Kenny checked off the box, again under penalty of perjury, that he had no guns. Mr. and Mrs. Grimes had an old gun, not a functioning gun, that I believe they were using as somewhat of a decoration in their home. But they did turn in an old, unused gun.
How can restraining orders bring peace of mind when you live so close and share so much?
You have to stay away from your neighbor. You're gonna pass them on the driveway. You're gonna see them at the mailbox. You're gonna bump into them.
But words on paper don't stop the Grimes from driving over the piece of property their neighbor says is his, and his alone. And John Kenny isn't backing down either.
It was Monday, January 29th, 2007. My mom was at that time working at a retirement home as like kind of a nurse aide in Carmel Valley. Mel was in Salinas doing his lawyer thing.
Unbeknownst to the Grimes who were at work, Mr. Kenny had a boulder delivered sometime during the day.
The boulder stakes out Kenny's property line and makes it near impossible for the Grimes to get into their carport.
They had met at a restaurant in Carmel Valley, but because they came separate, they drove home separate, and that must have been right around like a 5 o'clock time. Kenny knew that putting that rock there was gonna get a reaction out of Mel, and he was gonna blow a fuse. My mom had drove up the driveway, and I would bet anything that as soon as Mel saw that rock, my mom just knew that he was gonna lose it.
If this is what John Kenny wanted, he gets his wish.
I had no idea it would ever turn to that at all, not in a million years.
Yes, it's an emergency. 82 Hitchcock Canyon Road. Our neighbors blocked our driveway.
The boulder is the final straw for Mel Grimes.
Please send somebody right away. Okay, we're getting units started. Okay. Where's the neighbor at? He's in his house. Please hurry. No, don't touch it. Let the police come. Don't do that, Mel. Then I'll go to his house.
The years of argument and allegations have all built to this moment. And it will end in tragedy.
I'm gonna go talk to him.
Oh, you shut up! Get off our line! Don't want me to get off your car. Please send someone. Hello? Hello?
what he said indicates to me an intentional, violent, horrible, murderous act.
On the night of January 29, 2007, gunshots ring out in the hills of Carmel Valley.
The 911 dispatched. Emergency responders got to the scene.
Outside the Grimes carport, they find two victims.
Mel Grimes was already deceased on the ground by the rock.
Like her husband, Elizabeth Grimes has been shot, but he's still alive.
Paramedics were attending to Elizabeth, and they asked her who had done this to her.
My neighbor.
She was transported to a trauma center. Mr. Kinney was then taken into custody and arrested for homicide.
It was about 10 o'clock at night. I was at home, 8-week-old baby. My daughter was asleep. There's a knock on the door. And he's like, is your dad Mel? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, he's dead. And, I mean, as cold as that, he's just like, is your mom Elizabeth? And I'm like, yeah. And, well, she's dead too. And I fainted.
Unfortunately, she died en route to the hospital in the helicopter. She didn't make it.
I knew it was going bad. Did I know that my parents were gonna get shot? No, not in a million years.
I was deeply shocked. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. How could this have got to this situation?
There was definitely a split in the community because the folks that went to John Kenny's church couldn't imagine that he would, at age 72, a man who'd never committed a crime in his life, there's no way he would have killed two people without reason.
John Kenny pleads not guilty. He claims he shot the Grimes in self-defense after Mel attacked him with a sledgehammer.
Off my property! Get off
it! But then the evidence reveals the truth of that awful night.
Ballistics and bullet trajectory showed what happened that day, and to see that Mr. Kenny's account of how Mel came at him with the sledgehammer or the shovel was not accurate.
During the struggle, Elizabeth was still on the phone with 911. Everything was recorded.
He's blocked the driveway with what? With a big, huge boulder.
We know that he came out of his house knowing that there'd be a confrontation. And we know that he walked down his driveway with a loaded .45 and had it concealed. He's pushing her, get out of here, moving her off the property. Mel sees this, and so Mel comes to her rescue. We hear Elizabeth say, we know that Mel's DNA was found on the site of the gun. And the only explanation for that the first thing Kenny did was strike Mel across the face with the gun. That knocked Mel back, and then Kenny proceeded to shoot him.
But the neighbor didn't stop there. He turned the gun on Elizabeth. The recording captured the last words she and Mel spoke.
No, I don't. Hello? Hello?
One of the bullets that struck Elizabeth Grimes was very singular in the path that it left.
No, no!
In order for it to have left this trajectory, her body needed to be positioned in a certain way. The shot came from above at a very steep angle, with the person having their arm up like this, as if they were trying to protect themselves.
The evidence is clear. Elizabeth Grimes was shot to death by John Kenny as she lay defenseless on the ground. Even more chilling are the words many contend can be heard on the 911 call, spoken by John as he stood over his victim.
And he said, "Welcome to hell, Elizabeth," and then shot her in the back. Didn't realize my mom had the phone with her, and she was on the phone with 911.
Hello? Hello?
They found Kenny guilty of the first-degree murder of Elizabeth Grimes, meaning it was done with premeditation and deliberation and the intent to kill, and the second-degree murder of Mel Grimes. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
For a guy that's so controlling to be in a 5x8 cell with two other people that probably didn't get past third grade telling him how it's gonna be, that's the justice I was looking for. Because that's just a living hell for John, for someone who's a control freak like that.
Knowing Jack Kenny the way I knew him, and thinking that this man has to spend the rest of his days in jail, it's a tragedy that adds nothing.
Maybe the saddest piece of this whole story comes to light soon after the killings. It turns out Mel and Elizabeth had decided to move after all.
Hey, Mel and Elizabeth, great news! The house in Hawaii that you've had your eye on, it's available.
And when that real estate agent called me and said that, I'd like to speak to Elizabeth, the property that they're looking at is available, it caught me completely off guard. I was like, whoa, they were seriously gonna do it. I so wish my parents had moved.
The call came in just after midnight, the kind of call that doesn't just wake a town, it stains it. A woman's voice, shaking, barely holding together, reporting something she couldn't fully describe, only repeat over and over again. He's gone, he's just gone. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No blood. Just a house that still felt lived in, and a man who had vanished into nothing. In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, 1992 didn't feel like the kind of year that would birth a cold case. This was the kind of place where neighbors waved from driveways, where doors were sometimes left unlocked, where crime belonged to somewhere else, somewhere distant, something you watched on the news, not something that seeped into your own walls. But by sunrise, police tape cut through that illusion like a blade. The missing man was 34-year-old Daniel Hargrove, accountant, husband, no criminal record, no known enemies, the kind of name that disappears easily into paperwork until it doesn't. His car was still in the driveway. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His watch, still ticking, sat beside a half-finished cup of coffee, now cold. Everything suggested interruption. Everything suggested he hadn't planned to leave. And yet, there was nothing. No noise reported, no witnesses, no trace of a struggle. Just absence. Clean. Precise. Almost deliberate. By noon, the first whispers began. Maybe he ran. Maybe he had a second life. Maybe he didn't want to be found. But those who knew him said the same thing, again and again, with quiet certainty. Daniel Hargrove didn't just disappear. Something happened. Something no one saw. Something no one heard. Detectives combed the house inch by inch. They dusted for prints that were already supposed to be there. They cataloged objects that didn't belong out of place, and yet nothing stood out. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. No sign that anything violent had occurred. Except for one detail. Upstairs, in the bedroom, the bed was unmade. Not unusual, but one side of it had been slept in, the other untouched. His wife, Laura, told them she had fallen asleep on the couch that night. Said she had been watching television. Said she must have drifted off. Said when she woke up, the house was too quiet. Too still. Too wrong. And Daniel was gone. At first, investigators didn't push her too hard. Shock looks different on everyone. Trauma distorts memory. People forget things, misplace details, fill gaps with guesses. But there was something in the way she told the story. Not inconsistent. Not contradictory. Just flat. As if she had already told it too many times. As if she had rehearsed it in her own mind long before the police arrived. Still, there was no evidence tying her to anything. No motive. No history of domestic conflict. No financial irregularities. No signs of an affair. Just a missing man and a house full of silence. Days passed. Then weeks. Search parties spread through nearby woods, fields, drainage ditches. Places where secrets tend to settle. Dogs picked up nothing. Helicopters scanned from above. Volunteers called his name into empty spaces that gave nothing back. No body. No trail. No answers. The case began to cool almost as quickly as it had ignited. And then, the first strange detail surfaced. A neighbor came forward, hesitant at first, then more certain as the memory sharpened. Around 2 a.m., she had seen a car parked down the street. Engine running. Lights off. Not unusual on its own. But this was a quiet neighborhood. Cars didn't idle in the dark for no reason. She couldn't describe the driver. Couldn't see inside. Only that the car had been there, and then it wasn't. Detectives tracked down every vehicle matching the vague description. Hundreds of them. None led anywhere. Another dead end. Another loose thread that refused to unravel. Months later, the case officially shifted classification. From missing person to suspected homicide. No announcement shook the community harder. Because now, the question wasn't where Daniel Hargrove had gone. It was who had made sure he would never come back.
And why?
Laura Hargrove stayed in the house. That alone unsettled people. Some said it meant innocence. Why would she stay if she had something to hide? Others said it meant control, staying close to the scene, close to whatever had happened, as if proximity could somehow anchor the truth in place. She gave interviews.
Calm.
Measured. Always the same message. I just want him found. But time has a way of eroding sympathy and replacing it with suspicion, especially when nothing changes. Years passed. The file thickened, but the answers didn't. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Memories blurred. What had once been urgent became archived, boxed, labeled, stored. A cold case. One more name in a system full of names that refuse to resolve. But cold doesn't mean dead. It means waiting. Waiting for something to shift. Waiting for one mistake. Waiting for one person to say something they weren't supposed to say. And nearly 3 decades later, that moment finally came. Not from new technology. Not from a sudden discovery. But from a man who had already walked away from the job. A retired detective. A file he couldn't forget. A detail that had never sat right. And a decision to look one more time. 30 years is a long time for silence to settle. Long enough for a house to change owners twice. Long enough for neighbors to forget the exact shade of fear that once clung to their street. Long enough for a name like Daniel Hargrove to fade from conversations, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher headlines, louder crimes. But not long enough for Detective Harold Bennett. Retired didn't mean finished. It just meant no one was officially asking him questions anymore. No reports to file. No briefings to attend. No deadlines. Just time and the cases that never left. And this one never did. It lived in the back of his mind like a splinter, small, buried, impossible to ignore. Because it hadn't failed loudly. It had failed quietly. Too quietly. Bennett had been there in 1992. Not the lead. Not the face of the investigation. Just another detective walking through a house that didn't feel right. He remembered the smell, coffee gone bitter, air too still, like something had already ended before anyone realized it had begun. He remembered Laura Hargrove sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, answering questions without hesitation. Not nervous. Not defensive. Just controlled. At the time, it hadn't been enough. Now, decades later, it was everything. The file sat where it always had, in a box, buried under years of other unresolved stories. But Bennett didn't need to read it to remember the shape of it. He knew where it bent, where it broke, where it simply stopped making sense. Still, he opened it. Page by page. Photo by photo. Statement by statement. And that's when it hit him again. The detail that never aligned. The timeline. Laura said she fell asleep on the couch. Said she woke up and Daniel was gone. Simple. Clean. Too clean. Because the medical examiner, brought in weeks later when the case shifted, had made a quiet observation buried deep in the report. Not about a body, because there wasn't one, but about habit, about routine. Daniel Hargrove had a documented sleep disorder, mild but consistent. He rarely went to bed before 1 a.m., sometimes later. His coworkers confirmed it. His records supported it. But Laura's statement placed him in bed before midnight. Asleep. Gone by morning. It didn't match. It never had. Back then, it was dismissed. People misremember. Nights blur. Time slips. But Bennett had learned something over the years. When everything else is missing, time becomes the only evidence left. And this time didn't add up. He leaned back in his chair, the file open in front of him, decades collapsing into a single point of focus. If Daniel wasn't in bed when Laura said he was, then where was he? And, more importantly, who last saw him alive? The official answer had always been Laura. But what if that wasn't true? Bennett started digging again, not as a detective bound by procedure, but as a man with nothing left to lose and one question that refused to die. He revisited old interviews, listened to recordings most people had forgotten existed. Voices from 1992, preserved in static and tape hiss, telling stories that once seemed complete. Until they didn't. One of them stood out immediately. A coworker, name barely remembered. Interviewed once, then never again. At the time, he had said something small. Almost nothing. I think he mentioned meeting someone. That was it. No follow-up. No detail. No urgency. Just a line that disappeared into the background noise of a case already slipping through their fingers. But now Bennett stopped. Rewound. Listened again. I think he mentioned meeting someone late. Said it was important. Important. That word hadn't meant anything then. Now it meant everything. Because Daniel Hargrove didn't disappear randomly. He stepped into something. Something planned. Something deliberate. Bennett tracked the coworker down. Older now. Slower. Memory faded but not gone. At first, he didn't remember the case at all. Then the name landed. And everything shifted. Yeah, I remember him, he said, voice tightening slightly. Good guy. Quiet. Kept to himself mostly. Bennett didn't waste time. You said he was meeting someone? A pause. Longer this time. I think so. Not sure. It was a long time ago. What do you remember? Another pause. Then, he seemed nervous. That wasn't in the original statement. Not written. Not recorded. Not followed up. About what? I don't know. He didn't say. Just different. Like something was off. Bennett felt it. That shift. That subtle movement in a case that had been frozen for decades. Did he say who he was meeting? No. Did he say where? Another pause. Then a slow exhale. No. But he did say something else. Bennett leaned forward, every sense narrowing. What? The man hesitated, as if unsure whether the memory was real or something constructed over time. Then he said it. He said if it worked, everything would change. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Because that wasn't a casual meeting. That wasn't routine. That was risk. That was intent. And suddenly, Daniel Hargrove wasn't just a missing man. He was a man who had stepped into something he believed would change his life. and never came back. Bennett left that conversation with something he hadn't had in 30 years. Direction. Because now, the case wasn't just about a disappearance. It was about a meeting, a moment, a decision, and someone else who had been there that night. Someone who had never been identified. Someone who had never been questioned. Or worse, someone who had been overlooked. He went back to the file again, this time not looking at what was there, but at what wasn't. No phone records. Limited in 1992. No surveillance. Too early. No digital trail. Just fragments. But fragments, if aligned correctly, could still form a picture. And one detail began to rise above the rest. The car. The neighbor's statement. 2 a.m. Engine running. Lights off. What if that wasn't random? What if that was the meeting? What if Daniel never made it back inside? The official narrative assumed he disappeared from the house. But what if the house was just the last place he was expected to be? Bennett felt the weight of it settle in. If Daniel left that night, voluntarily, quietly, to meet someone waiting in a car down the street, then everything changed. The timeline, the suspect pool, the entire foundation of the case. And Laura's story? It didn't just have gaps anymore. It had contradictions. Real ones. Because if Daniel left the house alive, then she either didn't know, or she wasn't telling the truth. And after 30 years, that difference mattered more than anything. Bennett closed the file slowly, the room around him silent except for the faint hum of a world that had long since moved on. But he hadn't. And now, neither would this case. Because cold cases don't stay cold forever. Not when someone keeps asking the wrong questions. Until they finally become the right ones. The house had been repainted. Different color. Different owners. Different life layered over the same structure where something had gone wrong in a way no one could fully explain. Children had grown up in those rooms. Furniture had been moved, replaced, discarded. Time had done what time always does. It softened the edges. But it hadn't erased them. Because when Harold Bennett stood across the street again, 3 decades later, the shape of the place hadn't changed. And neither had the question. Did Daniel Hargrove walk out of that house, or was he taken from it? The original investigation had treated the house like a sealed environment, a final scene. Every assumption built on the idea that whatever happened, happened inside. But Bennett wasn't looking at it that way anymore. He was looking at it like a threshold. A place someone left. A place someone didn't return to. He didn't knock on the door. Not yet. Instead, he walked the perimeter slowly, eyes tracing distances, angles, lines of sight. From the front window to the curb. From the curb to the spot where the neighbor claimed the car had been. It wasn't far. Too close to ignore. Too deliberate to dismiss. If a car had been waiting there at 2 a.m., engine running, lights off, it wasn't so China. It was positioned, chosen, meant to be unseen, but not inaccessible. Close enough for a quick exit. Far enough to avoid attention. Bennett could feel it now, the version of that night that had never been fully considered. Daniel steps outside. No struggle. No noise. Just a man leaving his own house in the middle of the night. Why? Because he planned to. Because someone was waiting. Because whatever he believed was about to happen mattered enough to risk everything. Bennett turned his attention back to the file, but this time through a different lens. He wasn't looking for evidence of a crime inside the house. He was looking for proof that Daniel had left it. Shoes. That was the first thing. The original inventory listed multiple pairs, all accounted for except one. Casual walking shoes, worn often, not found inside. At the time, it had been noted and dismissed. Missing items were expected in disappearances. People leave with things. But now, in this context, it meant something else. It meant preparation. Then the jacket. Early spring in Ohio. Nights still cold. No jacket recovered. No record of one left behind that matched what he typically wore outside. Another small detail. Another piece that quietly suggested he hadn't vanished in his sleep. He had gotten dressed. He had left. And no one had followed that thread far enough. Because they were looking in the wrong direction. Bennett drove to the police archive the same afternoon. The kind of place that smelled like paper and time, where cases went to sit in rows, waiting for something that rarely came. He requested the full evidence log. Not the summaries. Not the reports. Everything. Boxes were brought out. Sealed. Labeled. Untouched for years. He opened them carefully, methodically, like someone handling something fragile, not physically, but historically. Every document was a snapshot of a moment when the case was still alive. And buried in those boxes, he found it. A receipt. Crinkled. Faded. Easy to overlook. Dated the day before Daniel disappeared. A gas station. Time stamped. 11:42 p.m. Location. Less than 10 minutes from his house. That alone wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was what came after. There were no confirmed sightings of Daniel after that. No one saw him return home. No one saw him enter the house that night. Everything after 11:42 p.m. was assumed. Built entirely on Laura's statement. Bennett stared at the timestamp longer than he needed to. Because this wasn't just a receipt. It was the last verified moment Daniel Hargrove was alive. And it wasn't at home. It was out. Alone. Or maybe not alone. Because people don't usually stop for gas that late unless they're going somewhere. Or meeting someone. The timeline shifted again, tighter now, more defined. 11:42 p.m. gas station. Sometime after, unknown. 2 a.m. car seen idling near the house. Morning. Daniel reported missing. A gap. A dangerous one. And gaps like that don't stay empty forever. They get filled. With truth. Or with something designed to look like it. Bennett pulled surveillance logs from the gas station, knowing full well the footage itself was long gone. 1992 didn't preserve video like the present does. But sometimes logs remained. Maintenance records. Notes. Anything. Most of it was useless. Until it wasn't. One line, handwritten, barely legible. Camera 2 malfunction, intermittent blackout. Time frame. Late evening into early morning. The exact window Daniel had been there. Convenient. Too convenient. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Bennett didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not in cases like this. Because coincidences don't stack. They don't align this cleanly. They don't point in one direction over and over again. Someone had been there. Someone Daniel trusted enough to meet. Someone who either made sure they weren't seen, or knew they wouldn't be. And that narrowed things down. A stranger could be dangerous. But a familiar face? That's how people disappear without a sound. Bennett went back to Laura. Not in person. Not yet. He reviewed every interview she had ever given. Every statement. Every word. And for the first time, he stopped listening to what she said. And started focusing on what she didn't. She never mentioned the gas station. Never mentioned Daniel leaving the house. Never mentioned any plans, any meetings, any change in routine. Her version of events began and ended inside that house. Because in her story, he never left it. And that was the problem. Because now there was a growing body of evidence suggesting he did. Which meant one of two things. She didn't know. Or she was protecting something. Someone. Or herself. The difference between those possibilities wasn't just important. It was everything. Bennett leaned back, the pieces starting to lock into place with a quiet, unsettling precision. Daniel leaves the house. Meets someone. Something happens. And whatever that something is, it never gets reported. Never gets seen. Never gets found. Because whoever was there that night didn't make a mistake. Or if they did, it was small enough to go unnoticed. Until now. Because cold cases don't reopen with explosions. They reopen with whispers. With details that don't fit. With questions that refuse to stay buried. And Bennett could feel it. The case wasn't just shifting anymore. It was waking up. Slowly. Uneasily. But undeniably. And somewhere out there, someone who had lived 30 years believing this was over, was about to find out it wasn't. The first real crack didn't come from the past. It came from the present. Because when a case sits long enough, people stop guarding their stories the way they used to. Details loosen. Memories shift. And sometimes someone talks, not realizing that what they're saying matters now in a way it never did before. Bennett didn't start with suspects. He started with patterns. He built Daniel's last known day from the ground up, hour by hour, movement by movement, not relying on old summaries, not trusting conclusions that had been drawn too early, too quickly, based on assumptions that now felt fragile.
Morning.
Normal.
Work.
Routine. No signs of distress. No unusual calls logged. No behavioral flags. But late afternoon, that's where it bent. A phone call, logged at his office.
Short.
Under 2 minutes. No record of the number. Incoming. Untraceable with the technology at the time. Back then it was dismissed. Too brief. Too vague. Now, it stood out like a fracture line. Because after that call, multiple coworkers noted the same thing. Daniel changed. Subtle. But noticeable. Quieter than usual. Distracted. Not fearful, but focused, like someone turning something over in their mind, again and again, trying to decide whether to go through with it. And then came that line Bennett couldn't shake. If it works, everything changes. That wasn't random. That was expectation. That was risk weighed against reward. And that meant whoever he was meeting
held something.
Information.
Opportunity.
Leverage. Something worth stepping out into the dark for. Bennett started cross-referencing names. Not just close friends or family, but anyone who had intersected with Daniel in the months leading up to his disappearance.
Clients.
Co-workers. Old acquaintances. Anyone who could have called that office line and left no trace. And slowly, one name began to surface. Not loudly, not obviously, but consistently enough to feel wrong. Thomas Grady. Not a friend.
Not quite a colleague.
But connected. Grady had been a contractor, financial consulting, occasional overlap with Daniel's firm. Not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to know him. Close enough to call. Close enough to suggest a meeting. What made Bennett stop wasn't just the connection. It was the absence. Grady had never been seriously questioned. One brief interview. Early. Surface level. He had an alibi, claimed he was home that night. No one confirmed it, but at the time, it wasn't challenged. Because there was no reason to. Back then, the focus had been inside the house. Not outside it. Not down the street, in a parked car with the engine running. Bennett pulled Grady's file.
Thin. Too thin.
A few notes. A transcript. Nothing that dug deep enough to matter. But one detail stood out immediately. Vehicle. Dark-colored sedan. The neighbor's description had been vague, too vague to act on. But dark sedan. Engine running. Lights off. 2 a.m. It wasn't proof. But it wasn't nothing either. And in a case built on almost nothing, that was enough to move. Bennett drove out the next day. Not as a detective. Not officially. Just a man asking questions no one had asked the right way before. Grady still lived in Ohio. Same county. Different house. Different life. But not far enough away. That in itself said something. Because people who leave nothing behind usually don't stay close. They create distance. They disappear. Grady hadn't. He had stayed. Quietly.
Carefully.
Like someone confident the past wasn't coming back. Until now. The house was modest. Well kept. No signs of decay. No signs of chaos. The kind of place that didn't attract attention, didn't invite suspicion. Bennett stood at the door for a moment before knocking. Not hesitating. Measuring. Because once this started, it wouldn't stop. The door opened halfway. Grady looked older, of course. Everyone does after 30 years. But there was something else there too, something harder to define. Recognition. Not of Bennett specifically, but of the kind of visit this was. You hear about something? Grady asked, voice neutral, controlled. Bennett didn't waste time. Daniel Hargrove. The name landed. And for just a fraction of a second, something moved behind Grady's eyes. Gone almost instantly. But not fast enough. That was a long time ago, he said. Yeah, Bennett replied. It was. Silence stretched between them, thin but tense. Then Bennett stepped forward slightly. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Grady hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Sure. Inside, the house was quiet.
Orderly.
Nothing out of place. Bennett took it in quickly, instinctively, the way he always had. No visible signs of stress. No immediate red flags. But that didn't mean anything. Not yet. They sat, across from each other. No table between them. No barrier. Just space. And history. You were interviewed back in '92, Bennett began. Said you were home that night. I was. No one confirmed it. I lived alone. Still do. A pause. Then,
Yeah.
Bennett nodded slowly, letting the silence do its work. You ever meet Daniel that night?
No.
Too fast. Too clean. The same problem as before. Bennett leaned forward just slightly. He told someone he had a meeting. Grady didn't respond immediately. And that was the first real answer. People say a lot of things, he said finally. Yeah, Bennett replied. They do. Another pause. Longer this time. He stopped for gas at 11:42 p.m., Bennett continued. Never confirmed back home after that. Still nothing. But someone saw a car near his house around 2 a.m., engine running. Lights off. Grady's jaw tightened, just enough to notice. Lots of cars look the same at night. Yeah, Bennett said again. They do. And then he let it sit. Because pressure doesn't come from what you say. It comes from what you don't. From what you leave hanging in the air, unanswered, unresolved. Bennett stood up slowly. I'm going to be reopening this, he said. Officially. That got a reaction. Not fear. Not panic. Something else. Calculation. You do what you need to do, Grady replied. And just like that, the conversation ended.
Clean.
Controlled. But not convincing. Because if there was nothing there would have been nothing to hold back. Bennett stepped outside, the air colder than he expected. Or maybe it just felt that way now. Because for the first time, since reopening the file, this wasn't just theory anymore. This wasn't just a timeline shifting into place. This was a person.
A name.
A presence in the story that had been there all along. Just never fully seen. And now, the case wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't waiting. It was moving.
Slowly.
Deliberately. But in one direction. Toward the truth. Or toward something that had been buried so well. It had almost worked. Almost. But not quite. Because after 30 years, one thing was becoming clear. Daniel Hargrove hadn't just disappeared.
He had walked into something.
And whatever was waiting for him that night was still out there. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, almost invisibly, tightening around a person's routine, their habits, their sense of control, until something small slips. A glance too long. A pause too late. A detail that doesn't quite hold. And Thomas Grady had paused. Just once. But once was enough. Bennett didn't need a confession. Not yet. What he needed was friction, something that would force the past to rub against the present until sparks started to show. Because people who have lived with a secret for 30 years don't just forget it. They manage it. They rehearse it. They build their lives around it so carefully that any disruption feels like a threat. And Bennett had just become one. He went back to the station the next morning, not as a retired man with a theory, but as someone carrying something heavier, momentum. Cold cases don't reopen easily. They resist. Files are sealed in more ways than one, procedurally, politically, emotionally. But sometimes, all it takes is one detail that shouldn't exist. And now he had several. The timeline, the gas station, the missing shoes, the unverified alibi, the car. And most importantly, a man who reacted when he shouldn't have. It was enough. The case was officially reopened within the week. Not loudly. No press. No announcement. Just paperwork moving quietly through channels, signatures collected, access granted. And suddenly, what had been a forgotten file was active again.
Alive.
The first step wasn't confrontation. It was reconstruction. Because if Daniel Hargrove had left his house that night to meet someone, then there had to be a path, physical, traceable, even after all this time. Bennett pulled old maps, street layouts from 1992, property lines, lighting conditions, everything that had existed before the neighborhood changed, before trees grew taller, before structures shifted. And one thing became immediately clear. There were only two clean ways out of that street without drawing attention. One toward the main road, well-lit, more traffic. The other darker, quieter, less direct. If someone wanted to meet without being seen, without being remembered, they wouldn't choose the obvious path. They would choose the one that disappeared. Bennett drove it himself.
Same time.
Same hour. 2 a.m. The world looked different then. Quieter. Thinner. Like the edges of reality had softened just enough for something to slip through unnoticed. He parked where the neighbor said the car had been, turned the engine off, sat in the dark, and waited, not for anything to happen,
but to understand what could have.
From that position, the house was partially visible. Not fully, just enough to see movement. Not enough to identify it. A person stepping out. A door closing. A shadow crossing the yard. It would be easy to miss. Easy to ignore. Easy to forget by morning. Bennett stepped out of the car and walked the distance slowly. From curb to door. Door to curb.
Timing it.
Measuring it.
Seconds.
That's all it would take. A quick exchange. A quiet entry. No noise. No witnesses. And then, gone. He stopped halfway back to the car and looked around. That's when he noticed it. Not something new. Something old. A narrow access path between properties, partially hidden by overgrowth now, but clearly there in older maps. A service route. Rarely used. Not obvious unless you were looking for it. Or unless you already knew it was there. It connected the street to a back road. A road that didn't loop. A road that led out.
Clean. Direct.
Invisible from the main neighborhood. Bennett felt it settle in his chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. Whoever had been in that car that night didn't just pick a spot. They picked an exit. And that meant one thing. Daniel wasn't taken. He was delivered. Willingly. Right into a situation he didn't walk away from. Back at the station, Bennett requested something that hadn't been available in 1992. Financial records. Not just Daniel's. Grady's. Because if that meeting had been important, if it was supposed to change everything, then it wasn't just personal. It was transactional. Money leaves traces. Even decades later. It took time. Requests. Approvals. But eventually, the records came through. Incomplete. Fragmented. But enough. Because patterns don't need to be whole to be recognized. They just need to repeat. And there it was. Small transfers. Irregular. Spread out. Not enough to trigger alarms individually. But together, they formed a shape. Payments. Not from Daniel to Grady, but the other way around. Before the disappearance. And then, nothing. All transfers stopped the day after Daniel vanished.
Completely.
Clean cut. No tapering. No delay. Just ended. Bennett stared at the numbers, the dates aligning too perfectly to ignore. This wasn't a friendship. This wasn't casual. This was an arrangement. Something was being paid for. Something ongoing. And then, suddenly, it wasn't needed anymore. Because Daniel Hargrove was gone. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Like the walls themselves were closing in around the truth. Because money doesn't just disappear without reason. It stops when the purpose is gone. Or when the risk becomes too great. Bennett leaned back slowly, the pieces no longer scattered, no longer abstract. They were connecting. Forming something solid. Something dangerous. Grady pays Daniel. Daniel agrees to meet.
Late.
Quietly. Away from witnesses. Something happens. And after that, no more payments. No more Daniel. No more loose ends. At least, that's how it was supposed to go. But something had been left behind. Not physical. Not obvious. But persistent. A pattern. A behavior. A reaction. And now, after 30 years, it was finally being seen for what it was. Bennett closed the file again, but this time, it didn't feel like putting something away. It felt like locking onto it. Because this wasn't a mystery drifting in the dark anymore. It had direction. It had weight. It had a center. And that center had a name. Thomas Grady. The man who said he was home. The man who couldn't prove it. The man whose money stopped the moment Daniel disappeared. The man who paused just long enough. And now, for the first time since 1992, the case wasn't just asking questions. It was demanding answers. And those answers were getting closer. By the time the warrant was signed, the air inside the station had shifted. Not louder, not chaotic, just tighter. Because everyone involved understood the same thing without saying it out loud. This wasn't just another cold case being dusted off. This was a structure being rebuilt from fragments, and if even one piece held under pressure, everything else might collapse into place. Or collapse completely. There was no middle ground anymore. Thomas Grady had lived 3 decades without anyone knocking twice. Now they were coming back with authority. The warrant itself was narrow. Financial records, personal documents, anything linking him to Daniel Hargrove beyond what had already been documented. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise alarms from the outside. But inside that house, it was going to feel different. Because people can sense when a visit isn't casual. Even before a word is said. Bennett didn't lead the entry. He stood just behind, watching, listening, reading the space the moment the door opened. Grady looked the same as before.
Composed.
Measured. But something underneath had shifted. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. "You got a warrant?" he asked. They handed it over. He read it carefully. Too carefully. Buying time. Or trying to understand how far this had gone. Finally, he stepped aside. "Go ahead." The house that had seemed orderly before now felt staged. Not in an obvious way. Not like something had just been cleaned or rearranged. More like it had been maintained that way for years, intentionally, consistently, as if disorder itself was something to be avoided at all costs. Drawers were opened, files examined, boxes pulled from closets. Every item handled with the kind of precision that comes from knowing you're not just looking for objects, you're looking for mistakes. At first, nothing stood out. Paperwork was exactly what it should be. Tax returns, bills, routine,
Predictable.
safe. But then came the study, a smaller room, tucked away from the main living area. Less visible, less used. Or at least, that's how it appeared, until it didn't. One of the officers called out, "Detective, over here." Bennett stepped in slowly. There was a cabinet.
Locked.
Not unusual. People lock things. But in a house where everything else was accessible, open, almost deliberately transparent, a single locked cabinet felt out of place. "Key?" the officer asked. Grady, standing in the doorway now, didn't move immediately. "I don't remember where it is." That was the second crack.
Small.
But real. Because people remember what they lock away. Especially when they've kept it that way for years. The lock was forced.
Quick. Clean.
The cabinet opened. Inside, folders.
Old. Worn.
Not organized like the rest of the house. These weren't part of the routine. These were kept separate. Hidden. And as Bennett reached in and pulled the first one out, he already knew. This was it. The paper was aged, edges slightly curled, ink faded but still legible. Names. Numbers. Transactions. But not like the official records. These were personal. Handwritten notes alongside printed statements. Dates circled. Amounts underlined. And one name that appeared again and again. Daniel Hargrove. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times. With annotations.
Short. Cryptic.
But consistent. D. Confirmed.
D. Delay.
D. Final? That last one had a question mark. And it was dated the night before the disappearance. The room felt heavier instantly. Like something long buried had just been pulled into the light, and it didn't belong there. Bennett didn't say anything at first. He just kept turning pages. Because sometimes the silence says more than any accusation. Behind him, Grady shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting, like the ground beneath him had changed. "What is this?" one of the officers asked. Grady answered without hesitation. "Old business records. Too fast. Too clean." Again, Bennett looked up. Business records don't usually get locked away separately from everything else. No response. Another page. Another note. Another date. And then, a number. Larger than the others. Circled twice. With a single word written beside it. End. Dated the same day Daniel disappeared. Not the day before. Not the week before. The exact day. Bennett felt it click into place. Not fully. Not perfectly. But enough. This wasn't just payment. This was escalation. Something had been building. Something that required increasing amounts. Something that led to a final entry. End. He closed the folder slowly. Looked at Grady. End of what? Grady didn't answer. And this time, the silence wasn't controlled. It was defensive. A shift from management to containment. Because whatever story he had lived with for 30 years was starting to break. The rest of the search moved faster after that. More focused. More aggressive. Because now they weren't just looking. They were confirming. And confirmation came sooner than expected. Another box. Lower shelf. Unmarked. Inside. A watch.
Old. Stopped.
But instantly recognizable. Because Bennett had seen the photo. 30 years ago. On a kitchen counter.
Still ticking. Documented. Logged.
Never recovered. Until now. The room went completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Because this wasn't circumstantial anymore. This wasn't theory. This was possession. Of something that should never have left that house. Of something that connected directly. Physically. To a man who had vanished without a trace. Bennett picked it up carefully. Turned it over. Same scratches. Same wear. Time frozen. Just like the case had been. Until now. Behind him, Grady exhaled slowly. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just a release. Like something he had been holding in for a very long time had finally slipped. "You want to explain that?" Bennett asked. No immediate answer. Then, "It doesn't mean what you think."
But the tone had changed.
Gone was the clean confidence. The controlled distance. What replaced it was something thinner. Something strained. Because for the first time since this started, the past wasn't contained anymore. It was in the room. On the table. In his hands. And it wasn't going back into a box. Bennett stepped closer. Not aggressively. Not loudly. Just enough to remove the space between question and answer. "Then tell me what it means." Grady looked at the watch. Not at Bennett. Not at the officers. Just at the object that had survived longer than the truth. And for a moment, it looked like he might say something. Something real. Something final. But instead, he shook his head. Slowly. "I think you should leave." And just like that, the wall went back up. Not as strong. Not as clean. But still there. Still standing.
For now.
Bennett didn't push further. Not here. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end. This was the break. The point where everything shifts from possibility to inevitability. The watch was bagged. The files secured. The room cleared. And as they stepped out of the house, one thing was certain. This case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. Slowly. Relentlessly. And Thomas Grady was standing right at the center of it. The arrest didn't happen that day. And that was the most dangerous part. Because once a suspect knows the past is no longer buried, time stops being neutral. It becomes a weapon. Something that can be used to destroy evidence, reshape narratives, or disappear entirely. Thomas Grady had just watched 30 years collapse into a single afternoon. And then he was left alone. No cuffs. No charges. Just silence and the knowledge that everything had changed. Bennett knew that risk. He'd seen it before. Cases where they moved too slow after the first break, where the suspect used that narrow window to erase the last pieces of truth. But this wasn't 1992 anymore. This time they moved differently. Quiet surveillance. Unmarked vehicles. Eyes that didn't blink. Grady's house became a point on a map that never went unwatched. Day turned into night. Night into day. And for a while, nothing happened. He didn't run. Didn't panic. Didn't make any obvious mistakes. If anything, he became more still. More controlled. Like someone trying to shrink their world down to something manageable, something predictable, something that couldn't betray them. But control has limits. And pressure always finds them. The first sign came 3 days later. Grady left the house at 11:17 p.m.
Late.
Unusual, based on his current routine. No destination logged. No clear purpose. He drove without headlights for the first few seconds after pulling out. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to matter. Because people who aren't thinking about being watched don't do that. They just drive. The surveillance team followed at a distance. No sirens. No lights. Just shadows trailing shadows. Grady didn't head toward the main road. He took the quieter route. The same direction Bennett had traced days earlier. The same dark path that led away from the neighborhood without drawing attention. And suddenly, this wasn't just theory anymore. This was repetition. A pattern echoing itself across 30 years. The car slowed as it reached a stretch of road bordered by trees, dense enough to block sight lines, thin enough to allow access if you knew where to look. Grady pulled over. Engine running. Lights off. 2 a.m. came and went in silence. Inside the surveillance vehicle, no one spoke. Because they didn't need to. They all saw it. The same position. The same behavior. The same setup. A man sitting in the dark, exactly where someone had once been seen doing the same thing on the night Daniel Hargrove disappeared. Minutes passed. Then more. Grady didn't get out. Didn't make a call. Didn't move. He just sat there. Waiting. Or remembering. Or both. Bennett, listening in remotely, felt something settle into place with a quiet, undeniable certainty. This wasn't coincidence. This was ritual. Something unfinished. Something that had never fully left him. Because people don't return to places like this for no reason. Not at this hour. Not in this way. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, Grady moved. The engine revved slightly. The car pulled back onto the road. And just like that, it was over. But not really. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't an action. It was a fracture. A moment where the past bled into the present just enough to be seen. And once seen, it couldn't be ignored. The next morning, the pressure increased. Not visibly, not publicly, but inside the system, everything accelerated. The watch, the files, the financial records. Now this, behavioral evidence, pattern confirmation. It wasn't enough for a conviction. Not yet, but it was enough for something else. Interrogation. This time, not as a conversation. Not as a voluntary exchange, but as a controlled environment where silence would have weight. Grady was brought in that afternoon. No resistance. No argument. Just a quiet compliance that felt rehearsed. Like he had always known this moment might come. The room was small. Neutral. No distractions. Just a table.
2 chairs.
And the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels loaded. Bennett sat across from him. Not as a retired man anymore, but as the one person in the room who had carried this case longer than anyone else. For a while, neither of them spoke. Because this wasn't about rushing. This was about timing. "You went out last night," Bennett said finally. Grady didn't react. "I drive sometimes," he replied. Same route. Still nothing. Same spot. A pause.
Short, but there.
Just driving. Bennett nodded slightly. Engine running. Lights off. Now a shift. Subtle, but real. Because the pattern was being named. Out loud. And once something is spoken, it becomes harder to control. "You think that means something?" Grady asked. "I think you went back," Bennett said. To where? Bennett leaned forward just slightly. To the last place you saw him.
Silence. Thick.
Heavy. Uncomfortable. Because that wasn't a question. That was a statement. Grady exhaled slowly. Shook his head. You don't have a body. And there it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Not even deflection. Just a fact.
Cold.
Precise. Calculated. Because in his mind, that was still the shield. No body. No case. No proof. 30 years of distance protecting him. Or so he thought. Bennett didn't respond immediately. He let the words sit. Let them echo in the space between them. Then, no, he said quietly. We don't. A pause. Then he reached into the folder and placed something on the table. The watch. Grady's eyes flicked down. Just for a second. But that was enough. Because recognition doesn't lie. Found that in your house, Bennett continued. No response. You want to tell me how it got there? Grady didn't answer. Didn't look away. Just stared at the watch like it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Like it had broken some kind of agreement. Unspoken. Unwritten. But real. The room tightened again. Not physically, but psychologically. Because the distance between them was gone now. Replaced by something else. Something sharper. You said you were home that night, Bennett said. No reply. You said you never saw him. Nothing. You said nothing happened. Still nothing. Bennett leaned back, slightly. Gave the space room to breathe. Then, you keep going back to that road. That landed. Different from the others. More personal. More direct. Because it wasn't about the past.
It was about now.
About behavior that couldn't be explained away by time. You sit there, Bennett continued. Same way. Same place. Grady's jaw tightened. Why? Silence. Longer this time.
Strained.
Because this wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about memory. About something internal. Something he couldn't easily control. And for the first time since the interrogation began, Grady looked tired. Not physically, but mentally. Like the effort of holding everything together was starting to show. It doesn't matter, he said finally. Quiet. Flat.
Wrong.
Because it did matter. It mattered more than anything. Bennett leaned forward one last time. Then why do you keep going back? Grady didn't answer. Not this time. Not at all. And that silence said more than anything he had spoken so far. Because somewhere in that darkness, on that road, 30 years ago, something had happened. Something final. Something that had never been undone. And no matter how carefully it had been hidden, no matter how completely it had been buried, it was still there, waiting, just like it always had been. Silence, in an interrogation room, isn't empty. It breathes. It presses. It forces something out of you, if not words, then cracks. And Thomas Grady was starting to crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in ways that couldn't be reversed. Because once a man realizes the past is no longer contained, something shifts inside him. The control he spent decades building begins to feel fragile, temporary, exposed. And the smallest question can start to feel like a threat. Bennett didn't rush it. He had seen this before, the moment where pushing too hard closes everything, but stepping back just enough lets the pressure do the work for you. So, he changed direction. Not the facts. The focus. You paid him, Bennett said quietly. No accusation in the tone. Just wait. Grady didn't respond. Over months. Small amounts. Then bigger. Still nothing. Then one final payment. A pause. And this time, a flicker. Because money isn't emotional. It's logical.
Structured.
Harder to explain away when the pattern is clear. That wasn't random, Bennett continued. That was building towards something. Grady's eyes stayed on the table, but his breathing had changed. Slightly faster. Less controlled. You don't pay someone like that unless they have something you need. Silence. You don't stop paying unless that need disappears. Another pause. Then Bennett leaned in just a fraction. So, what did he have? Nothing. But the silence felt different now. Not solid. Not defensive. More like something being held back. Something close to the surface. You keep going back to that road, Bennett said again. Not your house. Not his. That road. Grady closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. But it was the first time he had disengaged from the room. From the control. From the script. And when he opened them again, something had changed. He wasn't supposed to make it complicated. The words came out low. Almost like they weren't meant to be heard. Bennett didn't react. Didn't interrupt. Because this was the moment. What does that mean? He asked, just as quietly. Grady exhaled slowly.
Long.
Heavy. Like something he had been holding on to for decades was finally starting to loosen. He said it was simple, Grady continued. That it would be quick. Who said? A pause. Then, him. Daniel. For the first time, he wasn't just a name in a file. He was part of the conversation. Active. Present.
Real.
What was simple? Bennett asked. Another pause. Longer. More fragile. Grady's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Then, he had records. There it was.
Clear. Direct.
Irreversible. What kind of records? Grady shook his head slightly. Things that didn't match. Accounts. Numbers. Transfers that shouldn't have been there. Financial. Hidden. Dangerous. Bennett felt the pieces shift again, this time faster. More aggressively. Because this changed the entire shape of the case. This wasn't random. This wasn't personal. This was leverage. Blackmail. Or something close to it. You were paying him to keep quiet, Bennett said. Grady didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. And that was enough. At first, it worked, Grady continued. He took the money. Stayed quiet.
A breath.
But then he wanted more. Of course he did. Because leverage grows. Because once a line is crossed, it doesn't reset, it expands. He said if I didn't agree, Grady stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Because the implication was already there. Exposure.
Ruin.
Everything collapsing. So you met him, Bennett said. Grady nodded.
Slowly.
Yes. The first confirmation.
Direct.
Undeniable. Where? That road. The same road. The same place. The same darkness that had held the truth for 30 years. Why there? No one goes there. Not at that hour. Simple. Calculated. Effective. Bennett kept his voice steady. What happened? And for a moment, it looked like Grady might stop. Like he might pull back, shut it down, retreat into silence again. But something had already broken. And broken things don't go back to how they were. He got in the car, Grady said. The image snapped into place instantly. Daniel stepping out. Walking down the street. Opening the door. Sitting inside. No struggle. No noise. Just trust. Or necessity. What did he want? Bennett asked. More money. How much? A lot. Did you agree? Grady shook his head.
No.
A pause. Then, he started talking. The room felt smaller. Tighter. Because this was it. The edge of the moment. What did he say? Grady's jaw clenched. He said he had copies. That, if anything happened to him, it wouldn't matter. Insurance. Smart. Dangerous. And then, Grady looked away. Not at the wall. Not at the floor. Somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't in that room. Somewhere darker. He shouldn't have said that. The words were flat. Cold. Final. Bennett didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Because the next part, the part that had been missing for 30 years, was right there, waiting. What happened next? A long silence. Long enough to feel like it might never end. Then, it got out of control. The most common sentence in cases like this. The one that tries to soften what comes after. The one that never actually does.
How?
Bennett asked. Grady's hands tightened again. His voice dropped. I didn't mean to.
He stopped.
Cut himself off. Too late. Because intent doesn't erase outcome. And partial truths don't hold. You didn't mean to what? Bennett pressed. No answer. Just breathing. Uneven now. Unsteady. Because the line had been crossed. And there was no way back. You didn't mean to kill him? Bennett said. The word hung in the air. Heavy.
Permanent.
Grady didn't respond. But his silence this time wasn't denial. It was collapse. Because everything that had been controlled, measured, hidden, was now exposed. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Enough to change everything. Enough to turn a cold case into something alive. Something prosecutable. Something real. Bennett sat back slowly, letting the moment settle. Because this wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still one thing missing. The one thing Grady had already pointed to. The one thing he believed still protected him. No body. No proof. No final answer.
Just a story.
And stories can be denied, twisted, destroyed, unless they're anchored to something undeniable. Something physical. Something that can't be argued away. Bennett looked at him one last time. You keep going back to that road, he said. Grady didn't respond. You sit there. Same spot. Nothing. You don't do that unless something is still there. A pause. Then, a whisper. Almost too quiet to hear. I didn't leave him there. Bennett felt it hit. Sharp. Immediate. Because that changed everything. Then where? He asked. Grady closed his eyes again. Longer this time. And when he opened them, there was nothing controlled left in them. Just something raw. Something exposed. Something that had been buried for 30 years. And was finally starting to surface. But not all at once. Not yet. Because the truth, the full truth, was still just out of reach. And they both knew it. The room didn't feel the same anymore. Something had shifted permanently. Not just in what was said, but in what could no longer be unsaid. Thomas Grady had crossed a line without fully realizing it. A single sentence, quiet and almost accidental. I didn't leave him there. And just like that, the case expanded. Because now, the road wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Bennett didn't move right away. Didn't press. Didn't rush into the opening. Because this wasn't about forcing a confession anymore. It was about letting the truth unravel in the only way it could, piece by piece, under its own weight. You moved him, Bennett said finally. Not a question.
A fact.
Grady didn't respond. But his silence had changed again. Before, it had been resistance.
Now.
It felt like calculation breaking down. How far? Bennett asked. Still nothing. Same night. A flicker.
There.
Gone quickly. But not fast enough. Yes, Grady said. Barely audible. But clear. The timeline snapped tighter.
Faster.
More dangerous. Because this wasn't a disappearance anymore. It was a sequence. Meeting. Conflict.
Death.
Transport. Disposal. All within a window no one had ever fully examined.
How?
Bennett asked. Grady exhaled slowly. He was still moving. The words landed hard. Because they erased any remaining ambiguity. Any illusion of accident. Any possibility that this had ended quickly. Bennett's voice didn't change. What did you do? Grady stared at the table. At nothing. At everything. I put him in the trunk. Simple.
Direct.
Irreversible. The image formed instantly. The car. The engine running. Lights off. A man stepping involuntarily. And leaving in a way no one could see. Bennett let the silence stretch. Because once someone starts telling the truth, interrupting them is the fastest way to stop it. Where did you go? He asked. Grady didn't answer immediately. And this time, the hesitation felt different. Not fear. Not resistance. Something else. Something closer to distance. Like he wasn't in that room anymore. Like he was somewhere else entirely. It was dark, he said finally. Not an answer. A deflection. Or a memory. Where did you go? Bennett repeated. A longer pause. Then, I drove. Still not enough. Still not specific. Still not something that could be used. Bennett leaned forward slightly. You didn't just drive, he said. You went somewhere you already knew. That landed. Because random disposal doesn't last 30 years. But intentional concealment? That survives. Grady's jaw tightened. I didn't plan it, he said. Maybe not that night, Bennett replied. But you knew where to go. Silence. Then, a slow nod.
Small.
But undeniable. Because that was the difference. This wasn't panic. Not entirely. This was opportunity meeting knowledge. A place. A location. Somewhere that felt safe enough to hide something no one was supposed to find. Say it, Bennett said quietly. Grady shook his head. Not violently. Not emotionally. Just refusing. I've told you enough. And there it was again. That line. That limit. Because even now, after everything, he was still holding something back. Still protecting the final piece. The one thing that made the entire case real.
The body.
Because without it, there was still space for doubt. Still room for defense.
Still a gap that could be exploited.
Bennett sat back slowly. Studied him. Because this wasn't just about what Grady was saying. It was about what he believed. And right now, Grady still believed he had control over the ending. That he could choose how much truth came out. That he could stop just short of the point where everything became undeniable. But that belief
was about to break.
Because outside that room, the investigation hadn't stopped. It had accelerated. Teams were already mapping every possible route from that road. Every property Grady had access to in 1992. Every connection. Every piece of land, abandoned structure, storage site, anything that could hold something for 30 years without being disturbed. And one location had already started to stand out. Not because it was obvious, but because it wasn't. A property tied loosely to Grady through a third party, an old business associate. Long gone. Records incomplete but not erased. Rural. Isolated. And most importantly, unchanged. Bennett knew about it. Grady didn't know that he knew. And that difference was everything. You drove south, Bennett said suddenly. Grady's head lifted. Just slightly. Reaction. Instinctive. Uncontrolled. You didn't take the main road, Bennett continued. You took the back route. Less traffic. No lights. No answer. But the breathing changed again.
Faster.
You had somewhere in mind. Silence. You didn't leave him in the car. Nothing. You didn't bury him right away. A flicker. There was a structure, Bennett said.
Now.
A reaction.
Real.
Sharp. Because that wasn't a guess anymore. That was proximity. That's where you went, Bennett pressed. Grady shook his head. But it was weaker now. Less certain. Less controlled. You're wrong. But the words didn't hold. Not the way they had before. Because the truth has weight. And once it starts pressing in from the outside, it becomes harder to contain from the inside. Bennett leaned forward one last time. You think this ends with you not saying it, he said quietly. It doesn't. Grady didn't respond. You think we won't find it. Still nothing. You think 30 years is enough. A pause. Then, Bennett's voice dropped. Lower. Sharper. Then why do you keep going back? That question again. The one that didn't fit into logic. The one that didn't align with strategy. The one that pointed to something deeper than control. Something emotional. Something unresolved. Grady closed his eyes. Tighter this time. Like he was trying to block something out. But it didn't work. Because whatever he saw when he went back to that road was still there. Waiting. And for the first time, his voice cracked. Just slightly. I thought I could forget. Not denial. Not defense. Just truth.
Raw.
Unfiltered. And, Bennett asked. Grady opened his eyes slowly. And whatever had been holding him together
was gone.
I couldn't. The room went still again. But this time, it wasn't tension. It was gravity. Because the truth wasn't just coming out now. It was pulling everything down with it. And somewhere out there, in a place no one had looked closely enough before, Daniel Hargrove was still waiting to be found. Not lost. Not gone. Just hidden. For 30 years. And not for much longer. Once a man admits he couldn't forget, the past stops being abstract. It becomes a place.
A time.
A motion. A path retraced over and over in a mind that never rests. Thomas Grady's story, fragment by fragment, began to solidify under the weight of his own admissions. Bennett didn't need him to talk in full sentences. Every pause, every shift in tone, every hesitation carried meaning. Every flicker in the eyes, every slight gesture, was a breadcrumb. 30 years of avoidance, 30 years of careful memory, suddenly cracking at the edges. "He went with me," Grady said quietly, almost whispering, the words trembling as they left his mouth. Bennett leaned in. The room was taut, electric. "Where?" Grady's eyes darted to the floor, hands gripping the edge of the table.
"Out there," he said.
Simple, ambiguous, yet precise. Out there, a distance, a darkness, a place he thought he'd buried everything. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a story. It was an admission. The kind that could only have meaning to someone who knew exactly what Bennett already suspected. Bennett didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, let the gravity settle. Because now, the hunt had direction. Not just theory anymore. Physical. Tangible. Within reach. Outside, teams were mobilized. A network of investigators combing maps, revisiting old property records, searching for the overlooked, the hidden, the unchanged. Rural parcels, abandoned sheds, storage units, any place 30 years could not erase. The eyes of the present were everywhere, silent but persistent. Meanwhile, inside that room, Grady began to unravel in subtle ways. His breaths came faster. His posture shifted. 30 years of careful composure wasn't designed to hold up under direct confrontation with his own recollection. And yet, he tried to regain the control, tried to choose what to reveal, what to protect. But some truths are too heavy, and sometimes are too long. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he said finally. Words flat, measured, trying to minimize gravity. But gravity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about intent. "You didn't mean to what?" Bennett prompted, his voice calm, steady. The calm before a storm. Grady's eyes flicked up for the briefest moment. "I didn't mean to kill him." The words landed like a brick in the room. Silence, heavy and complete, pressed against the walls. 30 years of mystery, avoidance, and speculation condensed into a single, undeniable moment. Bennett absorbed it all. The hesitation, the admission, the lingering gap between what was said and what remained unsaid. One crucial question still loomed. The body. The final proof. The anchor that would make decades of theory irreversible. "Where is he?" Bennett asked, careful, deliberate. Every word measured, every syllable a probe. Grady's shoulders tightened. He shook his head. I can't say. Not yet." And there it was. The last wall. The final barrier between the cold case that had haunted Ohio for decades and the truth it demanded. A barrier built not of stone, not of evidence, but of memory and fear and the twisted logic of a man who had spent 30 years believing he could control it all. But Bennett had learned the rhythm of such walls. You don't crash them. You wait. You press subtly. You let the weight of inevitability do the work. "And the road?" Bennett continued. "You keep going back there. Every time. All these years. Why?" Grady's jaw clenched, hands tightening around the table. His eyes flickered toward the window, toward some internal map only he could see. "Because it's the only place I can remember him," he admitted finally. "The only place I can see him." The confession was raw, fragile, a crack in decades of stone-cold control. The room felt smaller, as though the walls themselves leaned in listening. Because when someone carries this long, the weight of memory is not a whisper. It is a presence. Bennett let the words settle. Didn't speak. Didn't interrupt. He knew the next move would come not from argument or logic, but from inevitability, the slow, crushing inevitability of the truth itself. Outside, search teams had pinpointed a location, a structure untouched for decades, linked through obscure records and forgotten associations. It was isolated, rural, hidden behind trees that had grown tall and thick over 30 years. Nothing had disturbed it. Not the seasons, not the neighbors, not time itself. Time had only waited. And inside that structure, the final pieces of Daniel Hargrove's story had been lying dormant, waiting for someone with the persistence to follow the breadcrumbs, the memory, the behavior. Waiting for the one person who would notice that a man going back to the same road, night after night, was not habit. It was confession. Bennett felt it pressing against the back of his mind, the culmination of 30 years of unanswered questions, the almost unbearable tension of closure inching closer, the knowledge that every step now would determine whether the case remained a shadow forever or finally became real. Grady shifted again, eyes haunted, voice tight. I thought I could make it disappear. Bennett's gaze hardened, steady, unwavering. Nothing disappears. Not after this long. Not now. For 30 years, Ohio had waited. The community had whispered rumors. Files had gathered dust. Investigators had moved on. But the truth, persistent, patient, relentless, had never left. And now, at the threshold of revelation, it pressed close. Immediate. Inescapable. The past, the present, and the reckoning had finally converged. 30 years of cold. 30 years of silence. 30 years of shadows. And, at last, a single spark had ignited. The case was alive. And Daniel Hargrove's story was finally coming home. The air was thick with anticipation. Outside, the search team moved with surgical precision. Unmarked cars glided along narrow dirt roads, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every footprint was calculated. Every angle mapped. Every inch of land scrutinized as if the earth itself had become part of the investigation. 30 years of neglect, of oversight, of assumptions, now obliterated by persistence. Inside, Thomas Grady sat silently, staring at the floor. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were fixed somewhere far away, retracing steps only he could see. Bennett watched quietly, letting him sit with attention. Because truth doesn't always need to be forced. Sometimes, it arrives under its own weight, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. And the cracks had already formed. Do you understand why we're here? Bennett asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, but heavy enough to press on the spaces between them. Grady nodded slightly. Not in submission, not in surrender, just acknowledgement. The weight of inevitability had arrived, and it was undeniable. The team outside signaled. The location had been reached. Bennett could hear the faint radio chatter. Unit 3 approaching. Structure located. Confirm access clear. Every word was deliberate, controlled. Every breath held. 30 years of mystery had led to this isolated, nondescript structure. No one could have guessed it would survive the decades untouched, no one but Grady. Bennett rose slowly, motioned for Grady to stand. They walked toward the waiting vehicles. Every step felt like it carried the past on their shoulders. As they approached the structure, the night seemed to contract around them. Trees loomed taller. Shadows stretched longer. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faintest echo of a life long hidden. Grady's steps faltered for a moment. His composure, carefully maintained for 3 decades, wavered. Bennett's hand touched lightly on his shoulder, guiding him forward. Not forceful, just present, just steady. Because the final confrontation wasn't about physical control. It was psychological, emotional, the kind that digs into memory and memory alone. The door to the structure was unlocked, faded with splintering slightly as it swung open. Inside, dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched from corner to corner, untouched by human hands. And there, in the center of the room, lay the remnants of a life interrupted, a truth concealed, silent, immovable, undeniable. Grady's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, shock, horror, and resignation all at once. Bennett didn't need to speak. He had already seen the truth in Grady's expression, the moment when denial collapses, when control evaporates, when the past can no longer be contained. The investigators moved carefully, documenting everything. Photographs, measurements, evidence collection. Each action meticulous, precise, preserving the integrity of a case 30 years in the making. Outside, the night seemed stiller, almost respectful of what was unfolding. No birds, no distant cars. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a story paused for decades, now resumed. Bennett watched Grady closely. The weight of realization pressed on him visibly. The man had finally confronted the immovable. 30 years of avoidance could no longer shield him. He wasn't just implicated anymore, he was exposed. Every decision, every action, every concealment came to light in a way that demanded accountability. And yet, there was something deeper than fear in his eyes. Remorse? Perhaps. Shock? Certainly. But also something more elusive: recognition. The unrelenting truth that no matter how carefully one buries a secret, the past has a way of catching up, persistent, patient, and inexorable. The search was thorough. Nothing overlooked. Every corner, every hidden crevice, every creaking floorboard examined. The evidence gathered was irrefutable, physical, concrete. The case that had haunted Ohio for decades now had substance, weight, and direction. The missing pieces of Daniel Hargrove's story had been found, and with them, the path to justice became clear. Bennett stood in the doorway, looking out into the night. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the chill of decades-long suspense finally broken. He turned to Grady, who had stopped speaking entirely, silent in the face of unyielding truth. There would be no escaping now. No rewriting history. No shadows to hide in. And in that moment, the weight of 30 years lifted slightly. Not for Grady, not entirely, but for the community, for those who had waited, and for the memory of Daniel Hargrove. Cold cases don't die quietly. They wait, patient, silent, observing. And when the right moment arrives, when persistence meets opportunity, they demand resolution. The officers moved in. The arrest was formal, inevitable, yet subdued. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, just the quiet acknowledgement that justice, slow, deliberate, relentless, had finally arrived. 30 years of questions, uncertainty, and suspense concluded in a single moment of accountability. As Bennett walked away from the structure, the night seemed to exhale. 30 years of cold shadows, of unanswered questions, of silence and speculation, now had clarity. The Ohio cold case was no longer cold. It burned bright with the clarity of truth finally revealed. And somewhere, in the echo of the night, the story of Daniel Hargrove could finally be told completely, no longer confined to speculation, rumor, or fear. The past had finally spoken. The silence had been broken. And for the first time in 3 decades, Ohio could breathe. Justice, delayed 30 years, had arrived. The cold case was solved. The community, shocked, haunted, and finally vindicated, would never forget. And Thomas Grady, once hidden behind decades of deception, would stand accountable at last. The world didn't explode the moment the news broke. It didn't erupt in riots or wild headlines. But the shockwave was there, quiet, deep, unshakable, sinking into the daily lives of people who had lived with this mystery for decades, never imagining it would finally be resolved. By morning, every local channel carried the story. Ohio papers printed headlines in bold type, the kind reserved for moments that leave communities breathless. Social media lit up with disbelief. People who had been teenagers in 1992 shared old memories of Daniel Hargrove, faces, stories, speculation, fragments of conversations from years long past. For some, it was vindication. For others, a reopening of old wounds. Inside the station, Bennett watched it all unfold on screens and scrolls, the public reaction mounting in real time. He didn't react. Not outwardly. His face was the same calm presence that had driven this case from cold file to courtroom reality, but inside, he felt the weight lifting slowly, like ice melting beneath a rising sun. Because he had seen something many others hadn't yet seen. Resolution doesn't erase pain. It only gives it shape. And shape matters. Detectives moved paper, made calls, arranged press briefings, coordinated with prosecutors. Evidence was submitted, files updated, legal motions drafted. What had been a cold case file for 30 years was now the centerpiece of a high-profile indictment. The arrest warrant for Thomas Grady had already been signed. Charges were filed: murder, obstruction, tampering with evidence, transporting a body. The list was long, deadly serious, and irrefutable. Grady himself, once calm, composed, unflappable, sat across from Bennett in that same interrogation room, this time not as a suspect hiding pieces of the truth, but as a man fully aware that what was hidden was now uncovered in every sense that mattered. No bravado, no denial, just quiet. "Why did you do it?" Bennett asked gently, not probing, not accusatory, but with the gravity of someone who already knew the answer. Grady didn't look away. "I thought I was protecting him," he said. Protecting. Not escaping justice. Not covering up a mistake. Not fear, but protection. A twisted logic shaped by years of secrecy, guilt, denial, and fear of consequence. That complicated something even more than murder. A man's attempt to rewrite his own conscience. It was the kind of answer that didn't simplify anything. It only made the tragedy greater. Outside, news crews set up cameras. Neighbors long retired from that street watched from a distance, riveted. Familiar faces older now, voices calmer, hands steadier, but eyes still holding that same old question: what really happened to Daniel? And now they had their answer. But with it came another question, one that didn't have a neat resolution. How do you live with knowing? How do you reconcile decades of uncertainty with sudden certainty? Some residents grieved. Some felt vindicated. Some felt betrayed. But virtually everyone was changed, in ways small or seismic. The legal process moved forward quickly now, propelled by evidence, confession fragments, physical proof, and a community's need for justice as much as closure. Grady's attorney tried to argue diminished responsibility, emotional distress, the impossibility of recall after such a long time, and even claimed residual memory trauma as a mitigating factor. But the facts refused to bend. Corroborated witness statements, the financial trail, the watch, the hidden location, the confession in pieces. All of it pointing to a conclusion that could no longer be questioned. In court, the prosecution laid out the timeline with precision. Hours, minutes, movements, motives. Not sensationalized, not dramatized. Just truth, cold, unrelenting, and absolute. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. No hesitation. No doubt. One voice collapsed into a chorus of accountability. Outside the courthouse, some cried. Some wept with relief. Others whispered only a word. Finally, and for the first time in 30 years, Daniel Hargrove's name wasn't just attached to a mystery. It was attached to a story with an ending. Not the ending anyone wished for. Not the ending anyone expected. But an ending that was real. That was acknowledged. That could be spoken aloud without hesitation. Bennett stood at a distance away from the crowd, silent as the verdict was read, caught in a moment that wasn't triumph, but resolution, the kind that leaves its mark like a scar, neither ugly nor beautiful, just permanent. He didn't need applause. He didn't want recognition. He wanted truth. And now, truth had been delivered. Not quietly, not without pain, but undeniably. That night, as the sun set over Ohio, something shifted in the community, not erased, not healed, but balanced. A chapter once suspended in uncertainty was now firmly closed. People talked. People remembered. People mourned. Families of those who had known Daniel gave statements, some angry, some grateful, some emotional beyond words. But all of them agreed on one thing. At last the silence was broken. The cold case that had haunted an entire region for decades was solved. And while justice arrived 30 years late, it still arrived. The story of Daniel Hargrove was no longer a rumor, a question, or a lingering fear. It was a truth carried forward. And for everyone who had waited, long past patience, long past hope, that truth was everything. The town didn't sleep that night. Windows glowed with muted light. Televisions replayed the arrest, the trial highlights, the quiet confessions. 30 years of whispers, rumors, and speculation had finally erupted into a chorus of acknowledgement. People spoke in hushed tones, leaning on each other, revisiting memories of Daniel Hargrove, not as a missing boy, but as a story that demanded to be remembered fully. In the quiet corners of homes, parents held children a little closer, remembering the fragility of life, the randomness of loss, and the persistence of justice, even when delayed decades. Neighbors walked the streets, retracing old paths, recalling shadows in the night, the times they thought they'd noticed something, the times they hadn't dared to speak. Every small recollection felt amplified, significant, part of a mosaic that had been incomplete for so long. Detective Bennett stayed in his office well past midnight, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing off the walls. The case file sat open before him. 30 years of cold leads, abandoned tips, false alarms, dead ends, and mysteries now converged into one undeniable truth. He touched the folder lightly, as though feeling the pulse of history itself. Each photograph, each document, each notation represented not just evidence, but the weight of years carried silently by a community, a family, a boy lost. Outside, the night wind rustled through the trees that had watched this town change over decades. Grady, now formally in custody, sat quietly in the lockup, stripped of the illusions of control he had carefully maintained. The man who had believed he could manipulate memory, bury truth, and erase accountability now faced the immovable certainty of law, evidence, and collective attention. His reflection in the dim corridor light was a man both broken and fully exposed, 30 years of deception compressed into every line on his face. But it wasn't just Grady or Bennett or even the legal system that felt the magnitude of this resolution. The community felt it too, a ripple through the fabric of daily life. School teachers recalled Daniel's smile. Friends remembered afternoons spent in laughter. Neighbors remembered doors left unlocked, a trust that had been violated and now acknowledged. Every corner of Ohio that had brushed against this story carried its own fragment of grief and closure. Statements began to circulate. Letters from old friends, testimonies from classmates, recollections from family members. All pieces of Daniel Hargrove's life now entering public consciousness, validated by truth. Social media carried the echoes, people posting photographs, memories, moments long hidden in shoeboxes, in mental archives, in conversations avoided. Everyone shared the same sense. Decades of mystery could no longer be a ghost. It had form. It had consequence. Bennett received a call from a former colleague, one who had worked on the original 1992 investigation. "You did it," the voice said. Not a question. Not a statement of congratulations exactly. Something quieter. "You ended it for all of us." He nodded silently, staring out the office window at the empty streets.
"No," he said.
"We ended it together." Finally, the case would go through the motions of the judicial system now. Appeals.
Statements.
Witness testimonies. Grady would face the consequences he had avoided for decades. But even as the procedural wheels began to turn, Bennett knew the real work. The work of reckoning, remembering, and acknowledging was just beginning for the community, for the families, and even for him. That night, the town was quiet, but the quiet was different. It wasn't passive.
It was charged. Alive.
Full of the knowledge that a shadow that had haunted them for 30 years had finally been confronted, that the truth was now tangible, and that memories, long deferred, could finally rest in clarity. And as Bennett closed the file one last time, he felt it, the subtle release of tension, the weight shifting from decades of cold silence to the clarity of revealed truth. 30 years had passed, and yet in that moment, justice, delayed, patient, relentless, had finally arrived. The Ohio cold case was no longer a question mark. It was a story, a warning, a confirmation that even the deepest shadows eventually meet the light. And Daniel Hargrove's memory, long suspended in uncertainty, could finally breathe. Months passed, but the echo of 30 years didn't fade. The streets of Ohio remained the same in structure, but not in memory. Trees grew taller, houses were repainted, children who hadn't been born in 1992 walked the sidewalks, but the shadow of Daniel Hargrove lingered, subtle and persistent, woven into the collective consciousness of the town. Families adjusted to the knowledge, but closure wasn't neat. Parents whispered his name in quiet rooms, sometimes to themselves, sometimes to the next generation. Friends revisited old photographs, each smile and gesture heavy with the weight of absence and the relief of truth. Every anniversary of his disappearance carried an edge sharper than it had before, proof that time didn't heal everything, but it could illuminate what was hidden. Thomas Grady sat behind bars, a man stripped of illusions. He read the reports of his own life, testimonies, newspaper articles, social media reactions. The control he had wielded for decades had dissolved into consequence. Every recollection, every detail he had once manipulated, now existed independently of him, documented and immutable. Nights in his cell were long, filled with memories that didn't bend to justification. For the first time in his life, the past pressed in without escape. Detective Bennett walked the quiet streets of the town, revisiting corners of memory, locations where clues had been overlooked, conversations long forgotten, faces etched into his mind for decades. He didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. He felt responsibility. For the years Daniel's story had been suspended, for the unanswered questions, for the grief carried silently by neighbors, families, and friends. But he also felt the subtle relief of truth restored, of a story finally complete. The community gathered quietly on anniversaries, lighting candles along the road Daniel had walked that night. Some left flowers, some simply stood in silence, gazing at the stars. The ritual was not about forgetting, nor forgiveness. It was about recognition, about making tangible the life that had been lost, the injustice that had persisted, and the relentless persistence of truth. Even in the courtroom, long after Grady had been sentenced, witnesses described the lasting impact, trauma not erased by verdicts, grief tempered but never removed, and a cautious hope that the transparency of justice might shield others from similar shadows. The cold case had become a symbol, a reminder that time does not erase accountability, and that patience, diligence, and courage can bring even the most hidden crimes into the light. And Bennett, standing once more at the edge of that same road where the case had begun decades earlier, felt the quiet resonance of everything he had witnessed: loss, fear, concealment, confession, and finally, revelation. The wind stirred the leaves, carrying with it a sense of solemnity, a lingering reminder that history is patient, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. Ohio would never forget. 30 years had passed, but Daniel Hargrove's story had finally been told in full. Shadows receded, but their memory remained. Lessons endured. Justice, delayed yet unbroken, had arrived. And in the quiet night, the town exhaled. The cold case was solved. The past, once suspended, had been reckoned with. And the story, painful, haunting, relentless, was now complete.